And then if you look at the external cycle, I mean, externally, we are seeing more conflict, right? More conflict in Europe, more conflict in the Middle East, and of course in Africa, and more tensions between big powers, right? So all of these points to a very bad worst case scenario, right? I mean, in which we might see things actually escalating from something very economic as a trade war to something a little bit more kinetic.
Hello and welcome to a special tariff edition of the TIO Talks podcast. As always, I am your host, Joe Willetts, and today I am joined, very grateful to be joined by our guest, Alfredo Montufar-Helu. Alfredo, welcome.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, can you give us a quick intro?
Absolutely. Well, my name, as already said, is Alfredo Montufar-Helu. I come from Mexico, and I've been in China for about 13 years. So right now I work for the conference board as senior advisor to the China Center, in which role my main task is to help multinationals to make a sense of what's happening in China from an economic, political, and geopolitical perspective, and to help them navigate the business landscape, which of course has become increasingly challenging given the geopolitical volatility that we are seeing today. I started my career here in China working for very small outlets, just looking at the economy at different sectors. And with time, I started doing work on several areas such as thought leadership, also policy proposals for the Chinese government, specifically on Belt and Road projects. And this took me to start just interacting with very senior leadership at companies. So right now, that's the background that led me to this current role where I just periodically interact with CEOs of multinationals.
Very good. And being from Mexico, what was the attraction to China, of course?
That's a very good question. So you might recall that several years ago, I mean, over a decade ago, China actually, although it's very far from Mexico, it does have, a very big, how do I say this? When China entered the World Trade Organization, it took very little time for it to actually surpass Mexico as the second most important trading partner of the US, right? And that had a very big impact, not only on the Mexican economy, but also on the Mexican psyche, because suddenly we know China is so far, but suddenly China is here, right? This big country that very rapidly is becoming very important from an economic perspective, but also from a political perspective. Now, at the time, I was studying international relations and political science. So that is my specialization in bachelor's. And of course, as an internationalist, the thing that, China becoming so important, it just captivated my attention, right? And I started studying more about China, getting very interested into China, and I decided to come. Initially for 2 years, but I stayed here.
As is always the way for a lot of foreigners.
Absolutely. I stayed here 1 year, then I went to the US to do my master's. I stayed in the US for another year after my master's. And then I decided to come back. And I've been here ever since. So overall, more than 12 years in China. Yes.
Wonderful. So as I mentioned, this is a tariff special of the TIO Talks podcast. The US tariffs have had a huge effect both domestically and internationally, despite the current pause that we are in. How do you view the situation and the potential avenues that it could go down?
Well, the first thing to mention, and although it sounds cliche, is that nobody wins a trade war. Really, nobody wins a trade war. And given that we are talking about the two largest economies of the world, what they're doing right now in terms of tariffs is impacting everyone else, right? So we've seen the US and China since Liberation Day on 2nd April, the level of tariffs that have been imposed on each other have reached, I think we didn't expect them to just become so bad so fast. So US and China is, at least on this term by this new administration, it's been 145% tariffs. But let's not forget that this comes on top of the tariffs that were imposed previously.
The first administration, yes.
Yes. And also, I mean, we are talking about several measures that were imposed also to restrict China's access to technology, right? And many other restrictions, licensing requirements, and so on and so forth. China has responded, of course, with tariffs of its own, 125% in total, but also several other restrictions and several other actions that they are taking to respond to these measures from the US. The one thing to mention from China, when I look at what's been happening, is that they've maintained a very reactive approach. So they haven't been unilaterally imposing tariffs. They've been waiting for tariffs to be imposed on China. They have assessed and they have responded. And I think that this leads to one of the key pillars of what I think is China's approach on this, which is, first of all, they all want negotiations, right? The US and China, I think, have been very clear that they are open to negotiating a trade deal. And I think that's the case for both sides. But for negotiations to happen, they are all asking different things. And that's driving the impasse right now that we are seeing. In China's side, on the China side, what China is asking is for negotiations to happen on equal footing, right? So that's key for them. And why is that important? Because equal footing means that the tariffs that the US has imposed on China have to be removed, right? If they impose more tariffs, then China has to respond with tariffs, because that would bring both sides to an equal footing, right? Of course, from the US side, the thinking is very different, because part of the reason why they started imposing tariffs on everyone was because they thought that the US was treated unfairly. So you could argue also that tariff imposition on their side is also to bring them to an equal footing. And so this understanding from both sides collides, as you can imagine. Both sides think they're on the right. Now, we're also seeing, if you look at media headlines, that each side is waiting for the other side to actually react first and come up with a proposition of what a deal could look like. But again, this collides with their own understanding of where they are at right now at this moment. So we are at an impasse. Now, of course, at the working level, there's been information that each side is talking with each other, but it has been unconfirmed. And in some instances, actually, it has been rejected officially. But
the Chinese side, yes, absolutely.
Yes, but I have no doubt that there are officials, not at the top level, but let's call mid-senior level, that are trying to work on something to try to actually get out of this mess. Because again, trade war is not good for anyone. And we've already seen companies on both sides, and I'm talking about small, medium-sized companies that are actually already being impacted very negatively because of this. They're closing shop, they're just not importing anymore because it's just too expensive, right? The tariffs are just too expensive. And if you think about some of the companies here in China, actually, they import from the US and then they export to the US, so that the impact is double, right? So no company can withstand these costs, especially when China's economy already domestically faces several headwinds. And we've seen the profitability of companies in China already shrinking, right? So with that as a background, tariffs obviously are making it just more difficult for them to survive.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask, what do you think of the current US administration's approach to the tariffs? The idea that America has a trade deficit, they take the trade deficit, they divide it by 2, and then they come up with a tariff on the EU, China, Mexico even. What do you think of that approach to adjusting the deficit?
Well, I mean, I couldn't say anything about what motivated the US administration to come up with such an approach. It's their decision as a sovereign country, but it's already been studied by think tanks in the US across the right and the left. And I think the consensus is that this wasn't a very scientific approach to decide the level of tariffs that would be imposed on each country, right? It wasn't scientific, and definitely has nothing to do, or is not grounded on economics or trade policy, right? So as to the methodology that led to these tariffs, I think it's consensus that it's not the best and most sound methodology, right? That said, again, this is a sovereign decision by a sovereign country, and they have their own logic that is driving this, right? So obviously, that's on them to explain and actually tell the country why, tell the world why they chose to do it this way.
Certainly, many have commented that, could this be a huge game of 4D chess from the mind of the current US administration, in that by imposing these tariffs, they could actually bring China to the table, negotiate some kind of trade deal, and then remove the tariffs. What would you say to that argument?
I think the US has been very clear. If you look at the declarations by the top authorities in the US right now, that they're looking for deals, right? For deals with everyone, right? And if you look at their decision to actually give every country except China 90 days to actually get a deal done and remove those reciprocal tariffs. I think that's the whole thing. So I do think, from the information we have, that one of the main drivers behind the imposition of these reciprocal tariffs has been to actually bring other countries to the table of negotiation, right? And I don't know how many countries have already reacted to this, but there have been countries that are already negotiating with the US. Of course, China is not one of them. So I would say that, that was one of the main drivers. Is that the only driver, though? I don't know, right? I think that clearly for this administration in the US, for example, fentanyl is also very important. It's a very important issue for them. And, I met some officials when they came here to China over the past months, and their message was clear. This is important for us. So they do have other drivers, other reasons for the imposition of tariffs. But making a deal is one of the biggest ones, I would say.
Sure. Absolutely. As a student of international relations, you would know history very much guides the future. And both sides of the US, left and right wing, have used the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 as a possible predictor of what could happen in terms of the trade deficits, in terms of the future, in terms of future tariffs. How would you look at that, the Smoot-Hawley Act, as a guide for what could potentially happen in the future?
I mean, it's a very good way of looking at things, because history repeats itself. Although we don't want to as human beings, there are so many lessons that we should have learned already, given past history. And unfortunately, we seem to be repeating the same mistakes, right? Things could go bad. We haven't reached the worst case scenario. Let's not even think about 1930. We can think about previous periods. For example, what led to the First World War, right? What led to the Second World War? This period resembles some of the things that the world saw at those times. I like to think about this using one of Ray Dalio's theses. So Ray Dalio is in Bridgewater Associates, very famous investor, but also very famous thinker, right? And he has this theory of the big cycle, right? And he mentions 3 cycles. Is the capital and debt cycle, the internal cycle, and the external cycle. And all of these 3 cycles swing, right? Between, for example, left and right, between, internal conflict to internal prosperity, or external conflict and external prosperity. And it's when these 3 cycles at the same time are in a downswing that we have this big down cycle. And when you have this big down cycle, you actually see very big structural changes worldwide. This is what actually precedes the rise of new empires and the I don't like to say it like this, but let's call it the erosion of all empires, right? if you look at what's happening right now from a capital market perspective, it's clear that there is a lot of debt in the world, right? So by his thesis, we are already seeing the down cycle in this debt or this downshift in this capital and debt cycle. So it's actually swinging down. If you look at the internal conditions of many countries in the world, it's clear that there is more social strife than ever, right? There is increasing inequality. People that have been disenfranchised from the benefits of globalization, free trade, are actually already fed up with the systems they have. And they are electing representatives that actually are very different from normal. So they don't want left and right anymore. They're choosing someone else. And this is not only seen in developing countries, it's also very much seen in developed countries, right? So there are changes. And you see increasing populism, increasing xenophobia, increasing protectionism. So again, that's a down cycle. And then if you look at the external cycle, I mean, externally, we are seeing more conflict, right? More conflict in Europe, more conflict in the Middle East, and of course in Africa, and more tensions between big powers, right? So all of these points to a very bad worst case scenario, right? I mean, in which we might see things actually escalating from something very economic as a trade war to something a little bit more kinetic, right? And I think that that's exactly what we don't want to go to, right? And that's exactly where we need cool minds, right? All these big powers to actually sit down and negotiate and try to avoid the wars from happening.
Focusing on China and the US as at least the two major players right now, how are both economies vulnerable to each other's or one another's tariffs?
Well, I'm no expert in the US economy, but let me just talk about the China economy, right? So since the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic hit China, exports have become an increasingly important driver of growth, right? It used to be that exports were very, very big, very important to drive growth China like years ago, but then internal consumption, so domestic consumption became more and more important. Now exports are back, right? Obviously, during the pandemic, China was about the only country that could produce many of the products that the world needed at that time, but they couldn't supply because of all these supply chain disruptions during COVID, right? So China's exports just rose magnificently, and they have remained there. They actually haven't normalized. They haven't remained there because obviously exports are offsetting some of the weakness that we are seeing in the domestic economy because of weakness of consumption and confidence of consumers. Now, the US by itself last year accounted for over 14.5% of China's exports went to the US, right? So the US is the single largest country destination for China's exports. So as a driver of growth, then the US is very important, right? Of course, if we talk about the European Union, about ASEAN, yeah, they're more important, but these are groupings, right? I'm talking about the single largest country. So the level of tariffs that both countries have on each other, 145, 125, makes it impossible to do trade. It's just impossible. So with this level of tariffs, basically what we are saying is that the US market is basically closed to Chinese competition, while the China market is becoming closed to US competition, right? So that is a problem, right? Now, China obviously is gonna get a negative impact because of this. But at the same time, we also need to consider or bear in mind that the government is very much willing and has already declared that they are going to stimulate as necessary. Now, during the two sessions, we saw the government already come up with a plan to actually increase new government debt to 11.86 trillion renminbi this year. And that's 2.9 trillion more than last year. Now, this actually was below market expectations. Expectations were that the added increase would be about 4 trillion because of the headwinds that the Chinese economy is experiencing domestically. But still, 11.86 trillion, or 2.9 more than last year, is a very big number. And more importantly, this is not a limit. So the government has made it very clear that they can increase it more if the circumstances warrant it. So what we are seeing is the government is going to respond to any type of weakness that is coming from trade side. That said, I think it's going to be very hard to adequately identify all of those companies that are being impacted by these tariffs. And that's a problem because companies that close shop because of how costly this is becoming, it means that there is more unemployment, it means that there is less income growth, it means also that there is then less consumption. And so it just further exacerbates the negative, the confidence weakness that we are seeing right now. So it will impact, right? And there are many already estimates of how much the impact will be, but the estimates are in the decrease of percentage points over GDP growth this year. So the impact can be significant. But again, when you talk about the outlook for the economy for this year, I think it's also important to consider the government's willingness to stimulate. So I think that's something that China has over the past year shown that when they say they're going to stimulate, they are going to stimulate. And we all need to bear that in mind. Now, on the US side, I'm not so sure how important the China market is to the overall US economy, right? Because the fact of the matter is that the US is the largest market for the exports of many countries, especially if you're talking about high value add, right? So it's not like there is a lot of, in terms of all things being equal, in terms of economic growth, it's not that the US economy is that dependent on China. It's not. But then if you're talking about specific sectors and about the specific companies, China clearly is a key market. And so some of the tariffs that China is imposing on some of the measures that they are retaliating with against the US, they're actually impacting companies in the US. And you see the headlines and you see, again, companies closing doors. You see big companies actually just losing profit, losing money because of this, not being able to export, for example, meat to China, or not being able to export certain items, right? So this is going to hurt them. You see, for example, already inflation in the US is increasing, not only eggs, many other items. And this is already hitting the population, and it's also being reflected in what they're asking the US government to do and their representatives to respond to. So I think that there are many citizens in the US that are already asking for a solution to this, right? So yeah.
We've also seen that in the current US government with Elon Musk being, squarely against the tariffs.
I think a lot of business leaders in the US, and by the way, I haven't seen Elon Musk. I haven't seen any business leader that is saying they're against what the administration in the US wants to do, right? I think that they're showing support, but I think that the majority of them agree that tariffs are bad for business, right? Of course, China, over the past decades of development, they've been able to grow to become one of the keynotes of international supply chains along the US and Germany. So China is one of the 3 most important keynotes. But also China is the one country whose sophistication of its industrial ecosystem, it's not replicated by anyone, right? It's unique. And it is that uniqueness and how it's also creating synergies because of its infrastructure connectivity that actually makes it very costly for most multinationals to suddenly say, okay, this market is closed, right? Because many of them produce here in China, not China for China, but actually China for the world. So this is obviously impacting them.
One of the key pillars of the tariffs, if you like, have been the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the US. Could you see an outcome where that actually happens, or because of the erratic nature of the current US administration, do you think that companies, if they do choose to move manufacturing to the US, would that just be completely undone in 2 years, 3 years perhaps?
Well, actually, if you look at some of the data that we have that from the US official data, actually, there has been, I wouldn't say that, when we say moving back, we need to be very careful, because those moving back means that you exit China and move to the US. And I think that the majority of companies are not doing that. What they're doing is they're investing more in the US, right? Some of these companies, either US companies or foreign companies, like foreign companies from the Europe, but also from Southeast Asia, they're, yes, investing more money in the US to establish production capacity there. But that does not mean that they're leaving China. So let's be very careful when we use moving back. Companies value access to the China market, access to the Chinese industrial ecosystem, but they also, obviously, in order to hedge and to protect themselves against this geopolitical volatility, they have to think about how they shift or how they change their supply chain strategies. Part of that is doing, for example, a combination of China for China. So what can I localize here in China in order to serve better the China market, but also to take advantage of China's innovations for competition, for instance, in Global South? What then can I actually build in an alternative hub? So let's say that part of your supply chains are impacted because of these geopolitical tensions. Then can that part actually be put somewhere else? Even if it's costly, I need to do it, because otherwise what I risk is the business continuity of my operations, right? And then also consideration is, what do I have to build in the US in order to circumvent these tensions, right? What do I need to build in the US? And so several companies are building in the US, and that has been the case over the past years. But again, moving back does not mean exiting, right?
So Alfredo, we've just come off the China Central Asia Foreign Ministers Conference. How does the tariff, or how could the tariffs act as a positive measure to promote cooperation among other countries, or bring other countries closer together in terms of their trade?
That is a very important question, especially given what's happening. But let me just take a step back. I think we must recognize that protectionism has been increasing over the past years, and this predates the current US administration. There are many reasons for this, but one of the most important was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption it caused in supply chains. Because I think we had an idea of what resilience means, and that idea was completely disrupted by this, right? So it just took 1 year the first year of the pandemic to demonstrate how vulnerable supply chains really are, right? How dependent every country is on international supply chains for the procurement of critical goods for their population, right? And how dependent these international supply chains are on the Chinese economy, right? So at that time, increasingly people were talking about, okay, we're too dependent on whether it's China, whether it's other country, or why is it that we cannot even provide, for example, masks for our people, right? How have we come to this kind of circumstance? What led us here? And of course, the answer is, well, globalization is what led us here, to these interdependencies that we have created across countries. And despite the goodness that globalization has meant for everyone, right, in terms of development and prosperity, we have seen some backtracking, right? And many countries are just more focused on securing critical supply chains, on trying to invest in rebuilding some of their capacity that moved out because of economic reasons to other countries. And so we are seeing that continuous trend everywhere, right? Everywhere. whether it's in developing countries or developed economies, right? To that, of course, we need to add also the fact that the global economy since the pandemic has not recovered. So in China, of course, we know that there are many headwinds that are impacting the economy, but there are also many headwinds globally. Many headwinds globally. We've seen European economies enter recessions. The US economy continues being very strong, but not as strong as before, right? And there are some people, actually, some analysts, thinking that the US might actually go into a recession, also because of the impact of tariffs. But the point is that the global economy is not doing as well as before. And against this backdrop, Chinese exports are leading to several criticisms because, of course, as I said before, exports have become a very important driver of growth. And the thing is that these exports are priced more competitively, in part because of some price wars in China, but they're priced more competitively. And in terms of quality, they're pretty similar to what foreign companies produce. So when they go to other markets, they start acquiring market share to the detriment of homegrown alternatives, right? And so for national governments, this is not okay, right? Because it disrupts employment, it disrupts prices, it disrupts the whole economy. So obviously there is criticism about that. And this ends up leading to a more protectionist stance, right? But what I'm seeing right now is that despite this protectionism, or maybe because of how extreme it has become due to Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs, I'm seeing over the past weeks, because we're talking about the weeks since Liberation Day, I'm seeing increasing momentum for countries to actually defend the stability of the post-World War trading and investment system, right? Of course, this system has been heavily criticized, is already obsolete in many ways, it needs reform. But also, we must recognize that large part of why the world is where it is in terms of economic development and prosperity is because of this system, is because of the stability it brought, because of institutions. Despite the fact that countries don't respect the rules as they should, despite the fact that there are controversies, that there are trade conflicts or tensions, the system has allowed for there to be some sort of stability. And this stability is very much needed right now. So we are seeing countries that are reacting against the possibility of, actually this system just going down, right? So they don't want that because these countries thrive due to trade, thrive due to cross-border investment. And so what we are seeing is that, of course, China very much wants a reform of the system, very much wants it to reflect more its interests and its voice, but also is not interested in having a complete debunkling of the system, right? So, and it's not only China, we're also seeing many Southeast Asian economies. For example, you might have seen what the Prime Minister in Singapore said about the importance of sustaining this system, right? And so in reaction against this possibility of bringing the system down, right? In reaction to this, in order to prevent this from happening, we are seeing more countries coming together, right? To try to find a way to cooperate, try to find a way to strengthen their trade and investment linkages, right? In order to continue benefiting and fostering trade. Now, it does beg the question, what does globalization look like in the next stage? And I think globalization is going to look a little bit more regional. So we're talking about the regionalization of globalization, right? Where we are going to have very dynamic regions that are committed to trade and to cross-border trade and investment, actually strengthening their ties amongst each other. And then perhaps regional trading blocs are actually going to trade so what I'm saying is that trading blocks, the countries within those trading blocks want to strengthen the linkages. But also what we're going to see perhaps is different trading blocks then trading amongst themselves and investing among themselves. So it's going to be a little bit more regional. And I think that also, it brings a question of what does a global multinational look like in this type of world. Multinationals are, in my view, going to continue being global. Those global multinationals won't stop that, but their supply chains will become heavily regionalized, right? Because of this.
Some have said China have taken advantage of the global trading system since joining the WTO. What would be your reaction to that in terms of they've talked about reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping, but then have not fully done it, essentially. They're still very internal. They are very somewhat closed off compared to economies like the US and the UK. What would be your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think if we look at the history, not only China, but every country has taken advantage of the global trading system, right? That's the reality. Now, China has not been as open as other countries. That is true too. And I think that's something that the Chinese government recognizes, which is why they continue trying to attract more foreign investment by, addressing some of their concerns with respect to the level playing field, with respect to the business environment, also with respect to which sectors are being fostered for foreign investment with the negative FDI list, right? So I think that it is true. I mean, we must recognize that China, when it entered the WTO, of course, there were several considerations that were given to China, right? As part of okay, you're going to be part of the global trading system. You need to prepare for this competition. Therefore, we are going to give you some, let's call it preferential treatment. But the idea is that gradually you become more open. And I think that China has been, good at some things, but it has been very slow at some other things, right? We must recognize that. So this criticism that China hasn't been as fast as it should have been, I think it's true, right? I do think it's true. But I also think that China is not only dealing with the impact of trade. We have to think also about the key challenges facing China right now are very much domestic, right? So it's about the structural imbalances that have been generated over the past decades of over-reliance on exports and investment and credit. So, of course, in the eye of in the mind of the government, there are competing priorities, right? And I think right now it's about what to do to boost growth through supply side stimulus, but also to try to foster some restructuring, rebalancing of the economy through demand side reforms. And at the same time, of course, how does this play in the whole, international arena, right? How does this connect with global trade? So there are different priorities, right? But I mean, to your question, I do think that there is progress to be made. I think that there is an intention to make that progress, but I think China could be faster.
And if we can just specialize it, being from Mexico, how have of course, mentioning things like NAFTA and now the USMCA, how have the tariff impacted, how could the tariffs impact businesses, trade, the people of Mexico especially, being so reliant on the US?
Well, I mean, tariffs, so US imposing 25% or a higher percentage of tariffs on Mexican goods. Of course, I mean, here's the thing. If the US had imposed tariffs only on Mexico and not on everyone else, then of course, companies that import products from Mexico, they might be able to find some other products that can replace Mexican products, right? Because obviously it's all about prices and costs. Right now, the thing is that tariffs were imposed on everyone. So, probably it's no longer so easy to find a replacement to Mexican products, right? Be that as it may, of course, tariffs, what they do is that they actually are an opportunity cost because they erode the competitive advantage or the comparative advantage of Mexican products in the US market, right? Because of prices. Because obviously importers pay the tariffs. So the US imposes 25% tariffs on Mexico. It's not Mexicans who pay the tariffs. It is the US importers that are going to pay those tariffs. And of course, that cost is passed to the consumer by increasing prices, right? So that is a problem that the US consumer is paying for, right? But of course, it also means that the Mexican companies may not be able to export as much as before, right? So that impacts the economy. Now, if Mexico were to impose, and I don't think they want to, but if they were to impose retaliatory tariffs on the US, it's even worse because right now Mexico is dealing with a lot of inflation, right? And so what happens then is that now the Mexican consumer is going to pay for this, right? So that's why I say that trade war, it's really nobody wins, everyone suffers. But yeah, I mean, given how much reliant the Mexican economy is on the US economy, of course, tariffs would have a severe impact on them, much more than on China, definitely.
And obviously in the first Trump administration, a lot of the tariffs were targeting China, obviously. But this idea of transshipments, the idea that goods from China would go to Mexico, they would be added in some way or changed in some way in Mexico, and then that would be the route that China used to access the US markets. How is that loophole, as maybe you would call it, being closed now?
Well, I mean, that's something that's that's obviously being targeted by the US administration, but not only Mexico, also other countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, because the reality is that Chinese manufacturers or foreign manufacturers in China, in order to circumvent duties, they actually can just establish some capacity in other markets and export from those markets. So, for example, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico too, right? And Mexico is a key target for doing this because of the FTA that it has with the US and Canada. So obviously, if you are going to be impacted by tariffs, you rather actually just put some capacity in Mexico. By the way, your supply chain partners are also in Mexico. So these big multinationals from Europe and the US, they also have presence in Mexico. So you putting your capacity there is not necessarily that difficult, right? You can actually just incorporate yourself very easily. And if you are a Chinese company that manufactures and not necessarily are part of the supply chain someone else, I mean, Mexican industrial ecosystem is also very sophisticated. So you can actually just establish some capacity there and automatically benefit from the FTA, circumventing the tariffs, but also getting some preferential treatment. The ability to do that is not the same as before. This is being targeted. I think the US has the view that Chinese companies should not be using third country markets as a springboard to the US market, right? So I believe that they are trying to do something about it, although nothing has come up like as a concrete measure for this.
So you've met and advised many CEOs in the past. Speaking broadly, CEOs from China, CEOs from the US, maybe Mexico as well, how would you advise them to approach the current climate, the current trade climate?
Well, I mean, one of the things when looking at the impact that this is all having on multinationals, whether they are foreign or China, is definitely we are seeing just a massive increase in uncertainty, right? And that's very important because foreign companies, companies, not only foreign, China and foreign companies, business leaders, whether they're facing negative or positive market conditions, as long as they can plan ahead and understand what they're going to do, then that's okay. There are steps to be taken in order to offset negative market conditions and steps to be taken in order to take advantage of positive market conditions. what happens with uncertainty, the unpredictability of it all, is that you don't necessarily know what to do, because you don't know where the next impact is going to come from and how it will come from, and then what it will lead to in terms of the deterioration maybe of your market share, in terms of, for example, just increasing the risk of being caught in the crossfire of tit-for-tat measures because of national security considerations from one or the other side. I mean, it just makes it very hard, right? Very hard to know what to do, and what that leads to is to an impasse in terms of investment plans, in terms of perhaps if you wanted to invest in a new project, you're just gonna hold off and you say, you know what, we cannot activate this because we are not sure what will happen next, right? So when I see what's happening with the international trading system and how companies are being affected by all of this, it's very hard to tell them, okay, this is what you need to do. Again, because of the whole uncertainty of things, right? The other thing that I advise to them is what to do about improving alignment between the top management here in China and their head offices. Because the way it has been working since the pandemic, and in the pandemic, of course, very few executives could travel to China, right? So that what it generates is there are increasing gaps of misinformation, right? Miscommunication. So there is a need to strengthen once again internally within companies that alignment, so that the head office understand what is happening on the ground here in China, whilst also the Chinese management understands what are the priorities at the global level, right? That alignment is important because companies in China are not only facing the impact of, trade tensions and geopolitical volatility. This is external, right? But some of the biggest challenges that they are facing right now has to do with the Chinese economy and its business landscape, so very internal. And I think that if we look at, geopolitical factors, economic factors, market factors, competition factors, the combination of all of these has led to what I call the emergence of a new competitive landscape in China, or if you will, a new competitive reality. And this new competitive reality is putting business resilience to the test like never before. It is definitely challenging the expectations around growth and profit that were generated over previous decades of double-digit growth, and it is also forcing a reconsideration of China's position in global supply chains. And this is happening for all companies, right? On the economic front, of course, people are buying less, they are saving more, they are downgrading their consumption to less expensive alternatives than they used to buy before. The thing is that China does have that, alternatives, and alternatives that do not represent a big trade-off in terms of quality, right? That's why they can pick and choose, because the Chinese companies right now, after decades of development, are able to produce goods that are maybe a little bit below quality, but many of them are equal or higher quality. You're talking, for example, new electric vehicles. New electric vehicles in China they are at the edge, right, of development. So this is a market where you have all of these alternatives, but where local companies, for them, the China market is the most important one. And that means that local companies are not only more willing to be agile, after all the head offices are here, but they're also more willing to decrease prices in order to get as much market share as they can, because this is survival for them. This is about survival. For foreign companies, China is a very important market, but they also have other channels for revenue, right? So here local companies are also pushing prices down. So prices are being dragged down because consumption is not as strong as before, because consumers are downgrading, but also because local competition is more intense than ever, and they're competing on the base of price, right? And so profitability or profit margins are decreasing, right? So this is one of the big impacts that foreign companies are seeing. And this is a disruption that is not staying in China, right? Because Chinese companies are increasingly, in order to find another growth engine, they're increasingly going to global South nations, for example, like Mexico. And the thing is that in global South nations, the middle classes are making the same spend calculations as in China, which is value for money. Now, in countries like Mexico, it's very hard to find a homegrown alternative that gives you the same kind of quality that you expect from what were you buying before. So here comes a Chinese alternative that gives you that quality. Suddenly you start buying Chinese, right? Mexico is a high growth emerging market. These same story is happening in other high growth emerging markets and in other less developed markets. So that is why Chinese companies are actually eating market share away of foreign companies in global South nations. Let's remember that global South were dominated by Western multinationals, right? So one of the things that I tell, against that backdrop, one of the things that I tell business leaders, whether they are top management in China or top global management, is that being in China is not only about the China market, because despite the fact that domestic demand has weakened, this is still a very important market and you can still make good money out of it, right? It just means that you need to recalibrate how you think about this market, and you have to rethink how to compete in order to win. But in addition to that, if you are thinking about the next 3 decades of growth for your global business, the competition in global South nations is going to come from China. If you are not here, you won't understand how to compete against Chinese companies. Being here is not only then about the China market, it's also about your global competitiveness. And I've seen many companies that are actually taking actions to actually do this and to incorporate Chinese innovation in their supply chains. And there are examples of some companies that by doing this, they are already successfully competing against Chinese alternatives here in China, but also in global South nations, Southeast Asia and Africa, right? So these companies are great case studies of what I would call is the new stage of globalization for multinationals, right? How do you use China supply chains to become more globally competitive? Because China is no longer what it used to be. It used to be. Made in China is no longer the synonym of cheap products. They might be less expensive, but they're not cheap, right? And so just the one thing that I tell them is like, if you look at all of these changes that are happening right now in China, and it's very important, because just a step back on this is that people look at what's happening to the Chinese economy and they start thinking about down cycles, right? China is experiencing an economic down cycle. And when you think that China is experiencing an economic down cycle, that I think is very dangerous, because you automatically start thinking about the up cycle. And so you say, okay, well, a down cycle, 3 years from now, there's going to be an up cycle, and we will be able to come back strong and continue benefiting from this important market. Well, geez, no, this is not an economic down cycle. What's underpinning the headwinds that China is experiencing domestically are structural imbalances, and they have reached a critical point. And addressing structural imbalances is not done in 3 years. It requires time, it requires significant reforms. China is aware of this, the government is aware of this. I think the new consumption plan that they released immediately after the 2 sessions is a way to show that they're aware of this. But still, I mean, we don't know how it will be implemented. We don't know about how many resources will actually back it in terms of money. And it just shows, or it just actually shows how difficult and how complex this is, right? For a country of 1.4 billion people, you think about everything that has to happen. Just for example, when people tell me, Alfredo, what would need to happen for consumption to go back to where it was? I tell them, well, it's all about consumer confidence, right? And so if you want to improve consumer confidence sustainably, then it's all about reducing people's need for precautionary savings, right? What do you need to do for this? Well, one of the key measures is strengthening the social safety net. China has been strengthening social safety net over the past years. But if you want to reach the level of social safety net that you can see in some of these Western European markets for a country of 1.4 billion people, it's gonna take a lot of time. So if that is what's needed for consumer confidence to go back, then of course it's not gonna be done in 3 years. So this is not a down cycle. It is a structural downshift. So if you take, as a company, a wait-and-see approach because you are waiting for things to get better, what you are doing is you are opening a window of opportunity for your competitors to get as much market share as they can from you. And once they get it, you're not going to get it back, right? So rather than wait-and-see approach or hold-and-growth approach, the best defense here is offense. You need to invest in your competitiveness, in understanding this market and how you can leverage its advantages in terms of innovation in your supply chains for global competition. You need to do it right now, right? And that is part of the recalibration that you need to undertake in the China market. So this is also one of the recommendations I give them. But for that, again, alignment. You need alignment between China and your head offices. You need to understand why this is needed. So I talk about, risk management, about preparing for this risk. Now I talk about this alignment and recalibrating your strategy in China. That's what I just talked about. The last thing that I would say is that this requires a whole of company approach. It's not only your China people here, it's also your head offices, maybe your regional leaders to understand where the company is going, why China is important, how does it factor in your global operations. And as you do that, message discipline. Because one of the challenges we face in a geopolitically uncertain environment is that it leads to more, as I just mentioned a little while ago, more public sentiment volatility. And public sentiment volatility increases reputational risks, right? And that can lead to boycotting, that can lead to other bad consequences, right, for multinationals and for business leaders. So there has to be very strict message discipline. You need to be careful about how you communicate, about how you build narratives, and about what you say at any given point in time.
So for businesses, international businesses, CEOs, this idea of adopting a wait-and-see approach, maybe waiting out these tariffs, you would not agree with that strategy?
I think that tariffs, tariffs is different from the more structural challenges that China is facing, right? I think that tariffs are part of this geopolitical uncertainty and unpredictability. And insofar they're part of that, I think that companies need to prepare for their impact, proactively prepare for their impact. Crisis management plans are very good, but that's reactive. That's already something happened and now you activate a crisis management plan. No. You need to proactively prepare for it. Contingency planning. Yes, of course, it's an analysis, but also if you already have a series of impacts that you think something can lead to this impact, for example, let's say you're going to be added into one of the lists. There's a possibility for that. Okay, well, what do you do right now? Right now, even if nothing is happening, but what do you do right now to understand what would lead you to that list, to be added to that list, and what could you do right now to reduce the risk of being added to that list? Who do you need to talk to? How do you need to strengthen your government affairs, for example? How do you need to integrate the understanding that is being or the knowledge that is being captured by your GA people into your strategy here in China, and how can you backfeed that into your head offices, right? So there are many things that you can think about what to do in order to be better prepared for an impact, right? And I think in terms of tariff, that's the one of the potential ways of trying to risk manage this whole thing. Now, I think the reason why people say that you need to wait it out is because tariffs are a sovereign decision. Companies can try to influence whether you impose or not impose tariffs, but ultimately the decision is of national governments. And so, I think that they can wait it out, but also, under the current conditions, I think that this also provides an opportunity for businesses and multinationals to try to bring out and play their very traditional role that they have played before as these bridge. Business multinationals have been playing a role as a bridging role between the West and China. And this is bridging role that has contributed to actually economic interactions and that have prevented tensions from rising. So I think under the current circumstances, businesses have the opportunity and perhaps the responsibility to continue playing that bridging role, to try to talk with the representatives, try to actually tell them, okay, why tariffs are not good. I'm not going to force your decision, but I'm telling you why tariffs are not good. Reconsider your decision and let's try to find a way out of this.
Speaking of this bridging role, and one of the major things to come out of the recent two sessions this year was the idea of increasing foreign direct investment into China. Why is there a bit of apathy towards from foreign companies investing in China? And how, in your roles as an advisor to CEO, have you kind of hoped to allay those fears?
Well, there are so many reasons for this. I think, first of all, if you look at the key risks that companies are looking at right now, of course, first risk has to be, and from my conversations with senior executives and CEOs, they're very worried about the state of the economy. So I was talking just now also about consumer confidence, the fact that people are consuming less. This is impacting their business and their profitability. So with less profitability, of course, then the business case for continuing investing is not there. So they have to actually think what they are going to do. Now, this is exacerbated, of course, by the situation of the geopolitical environment and tariffs, right? Because obviously this makes it very hard to actually understand what's going to happen next, right? So this further then, decreases the willingness to invest here, right? And of course, opposite to that is an understanding from the China government about the big role, the important role that foreign companies can play in contributing to its development priorities. I think it's always been the case that foreign investment, expertise, and technologies have played a critical role in China to bring it to its stage of development that they have right now. Now, it's very hard to tell a foreign multinational or a CEO like, oh, listen, you need to invest more. You need to. There is a business case to. It's not hard to tell them that there is a business case. Actually, it's something that I do every day, right? Like, why should you invest in China? Part of it is, as I said, well, the market is still here, the supply chains are still here. This is about your global competitiveness. But right now, given the state of the economy, it's harder and harder to understand where to invest and what does comparative advantage means, because they're facing a lot of very, very, very intense competition from local companies, and also because of the uncertainty of geopolitics. Where do they need to invest? Just very hard. But I do see companies that are making very good decisions on, for example, digital technologies, and are actually growing their business here. In a very, very sophisticated manner. There is a business case to continue investing. It's just that under the current circumstances, it's just harder to convince people. And you couldn't fold. I wouldn't want to be in the position of the global CEO of a multinational or China CEO at this point, because you have to make very tough decisions about investing, very tough decisions about your business that otherwise you wouldn't want to make.
So yes, for my last question, I want to talk about briefly reindustrialization. It's a very key concept today, and examples of putting it into practice would include the emergence of global supply chains, uneven labor costs, differences in the regulatory environments. So where should nations and major companies be focusing their efforts today in the current circumstances?
So this idea of reindustrialization is also related to this protectionist approach of bringing back or rebuilding your production capacity, right? Which is over the past years, as globalization has advanced, as our companies have internationalized their supply chains, some of the capacity has moved out of the country to other countries because their comparative advantage perhaps is that labor costs are less expensive, or just because they're just closer to our supply chain partners, and XYZ reason why supply chains move the way they move. And of course, given the impact of COVID, given Sino-Western tensions, given everything that we are seeing with populism and protectionism rising in the world, this is leading to more questions and demands for reindustrialization, right? Because it's about bringing back those critical supply chains, bringing back that manufacturing capacity. The idea being that the more able you are to have a stronger manufacturing sector, the more prosperous your economy will be. Now, the first thing to mention is that this is not so easily done. Reindustrialization is not so easily done. It takes years, it takes massive investments. And then the question is whether right now at this time, given what's happening to the economy, are companies ready, or is it viable for them to be making those investments right now to build capacity somewhere else where they don't have capacity, right? Can they do that? And if they do that, how extensive will the investment be? And if that investment is made, does that mean that somewhere else they are going to actually take out some money from somewhere else, or reduce their presence in other markets, right? I think that for some companies, it's just going to be very hard to be making very big investments over the coming years in order to try to foster reindustrialization. So from that perspective, then what reindustrialization needs is a lot of government support, right? Government support, subsidies, it needs preferential policies. You need to make it attractive for business to invest in your country if you're going to reindustrialize, right? You need to make it attractive so that they continue maintaining their profits, right? Now, even if you do that, the problem is after you reindustrialize, who is going to be working in those new factories, for example? It's not a question only about whether you have a sufficient big workforce. It's also a question of whether your workforce or your professionals want to actually be working on those jobs. And if that's not the case, do you have enough automation and AI to be doing this in order to actually for these factories to actually produce something, right? So it's a big question. It's a question that every country is asking, but it's also a question that will require, or actually perhaps the answer to that requires a lot of foresight into what the next stage of globalization will look like, right? Because it shouldn't be protectionist. At least that's my thinking.
So Alfredo, thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.
Very good to meet you. Hopefully we can meet again in the very near future. Just to end things, where can we hear more from you in the future?
Well, you can all add me in my LinkedIn. I'm very active in LinkedIn, but I'm also very active out there talking with media, I'm still, obviously a senior advisor at the Conference Board China Center. But, my intention is to stay here in China to continue helping. I see that as one of my roles, helping to bridge China and the West. I do believe that role is more important than ever. There is a lot of miscommunication out there. There is a lot of misunderstanding. And what we can contribute to is to try to address some of that misunderstanding so that things get back to where they were in terms of cooperation, in terms of working together for some of these more important topics, such as what's going to happen with climate change, what's going to happen with poverty, how can we just cooperate on prosperity for everyone, right? So yeah, you can definitely look me up. Look me up in the web, but I hope this is not the last time I'm here for TIO. So I suspect I will be.
It certainly won't be.
I will be here sharing more of my ideas and views with you.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Thank you also for joining us, and we will hope to see you and yourself again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.